Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormon Land. And if you haven't already, please follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. Joseph Fielding Smith's family tree alone makes him a significant player in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His father, Joseph F. Smith, was the faith's sixth president. His grandfather was Hiram Smith, who was slain with his great-uncle, church founder Joseph Smith. His son-in-law, in fact, was Apostle Bruce R. McConkie, a theological kindred spirit. Joseph Fielding Smith served as an apostle for 60 years, church historian for 49, and as the church's 10th president for 2. But he will forever be remembered more for his prose and his polemics than for his positions or his pedigree. A conservative and orthodox thinker, he wrote more than 24 books, answered religious questions from lay members, and engaged in high-level, high-stakes debates with fellow apostles James Talmage and John Widtsoe and other leading Latter-day Saint intellectuals. They discussed, debated, and disputed issues ranging from scriptural interpretation to the age of the earth and the theory of evolution. Joseph Fielding Smith was, scholar Matthew Bowman argues, quote, the most important Latter-day Saint theologian of the 20th century. Bowman, head of Mormon studies at Claremont Graduate University and author of the recently released Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian, joins us today to talk about this towering Mormon man of letters. Matt, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Matt, let's dive in a little bit on Joseph Fielding Smith, where you kind of start. You know how his father, that Joseph S. Smith, the president of the church, had to hide from federal agents during polygamy crackdowns, and then he gained influential church positions, and he was often absent from the family, and he felt like the church seemingly was under constant siege. Did that make an impression on him, and how it may have influenced his writings?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Joseph Fielding Smith really lived a rather difficult life. As you note, he was born in 1876. He grew up then. His early youth was happening in the period in which federal marshals were waging a real war on polygamy in the Utah Territory. One of his most traumatic memories was this Christmas time when his father and mother said goodbye to all of their children and fled the country to avoid persecution. And that really, really made an impact on him. He writes much later in his life about the memory of when federal marshals came pounding on his door when he's a little boy, after his parents have left. And there's real bitterness and kind of fear, I think, still in that writing. And that, I think, gives him this initial impression that the world is against his faith. And of course, as he grows up, he learns about the death of his own ancestors, Hiram Smith and Joseph Smith Sr., his own father, who saw his father and uncle's bloody bodies, tells his sons about this. And there's a real kind of legacy, I think, of family trauma here that Joseph Fielding Smith certainly carries throughout his life. And I think the roots of his sometimes aggressive polemics and his aggressive defenses of his church, I think, are rooted in that.
So in your research, what surprised you about him? And what do you think most people get wrong about Joseph Fielding Smith?
Oh, well, there's a few interesting things we could go to there. On the one hand, right, as I say, he had this, kind of tragic upbringing and tragedy throughout his life. He marries 3 times. His first and second wives both die young. His first wife in childbirth, his second wife, after a long period of depression, actually of a cerebral hemorrhage, he marries again after that, a much younger woman. She's more than 2 decades younger than him, and she also dies before he does. So he's widowed 3 times. And I think maybe because of that and because of the earlier family trauma that he had as well, he's actually in private a pretty affectionate person. One of his children writes that he insisted every time on seeing one of his children, he would insist on kissing them in the cheek, even in public, and this would embarrass them sometimes, and they wouldn't like it. When his sons go on missions, and he also has a couple sons serve in the military, and he loses actually one of his sons in the military during World War II. The letters he sends to them are this really fascinating mixture of long kind of theological disquisitions, but also really extensive and gossipy descriptions of University of Utah football games. He's a real sports fan, actually. He plays sports when he's young, and he follows football particularly throughout his life. Another memory, though, that one of his children has is of him singing the songs from Disney's Snow White to them when they were young, and when he had grandchildren, right? And so he was a Disney fan too, apparently, right? So there is this kind of playful side to him that you often can miss.
Yeah, his third wife was Jessie Evans Smith, and she was like a famous singer with the Tabernacle Choir, and she was quite gregarious, right, and funny. And you say that she was sometimes able to bring out his funny side. Are there any instances you can recall where she's able to do that? Or
yeah, in public, right? He is often somewhat stiff. He is very serious. He is stern, but she is a kind of legendary figure. There have been academic articles written about how entertaining she is and about the kind of the folklore that grows up around her. There's a famous story of her once visiting a church congregation with her husband, and she is complimented on her clothing, and she tells the people who compliment her that she is wearing her Bible dress, and they ask her what that means, and she gestures to her bosom and says, "Lo and behold, LOW," which is not what you would expect from the wife of Joseph Fielding Smith, right? So she is, she is gregarious, as you say, and she teases him a lot. There's a wonderful transcript of an oral history done with both her and her husband in church archives. And in this oral history, she teases him a lot. And she tells the interviewer that she kind of forces him to play the piano and sing with her. They're talking in this oral history about going on a church trip to England. And she's talking about how excited she is to go. And Joseph Fielding Smith simply says, "I don't want to go." And she says, "But you have to go because you're taking me." And then he says, "I only go because I have to." And then, the interviewer is saying how wonderful it will be for all the saints in England to see him. And he's saying, "I only go because people make me." So there's a kind of glumness to him, but I think also, she says that he has a very, very dry wit, and a very kind of dry sense of humor. And that comes through, I think, in him kind of performing this sort of glumness in this particular interview.
So let's get a little serious. How influential do you think his writings were, and are they still?
Quite. For many reasons. And I think the two most important reasons are, first, how prolific he is. You noted, Dave, how much he wrote in the introduction, but also I think for how long he is around. He is writing his first works of LDS theology for popular audiences. And I should say, nearly all of his works are intended for people to read. He is writing, I think, for an audience of lay members of his church, right? And he's able to connect with them because he has that sense. But his first writings to that end are published in the first decade of the 20th century, and he's still publishing 70 years later. Right? He lives for so long, and a whole generation of Latter-day Saints grows up with him presented as an authority to them. Indeed, there are a number of other apostles, right? People who become real allies of his, people who spread his work, people like, for instance, Harold B. Lee and Mark Peterson, right? These men are colleagues of his in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in the 1950s and 60s, but they were boys when he began writing, right? And so they grew up reading his work, and thus it really left an imprint on the church. And I want to point to one area in particular, and that is the church educational system. These apostles were part of a campaign in the church educational system to spread the work of Joseph Fielding Smith specifically, which they do in the 1950s and 1960s. His work is distributed to teachers in the church educational system, and it enters then when the correlation movement happens in the 60s and 70s, it enters into the church curriculum committees. And his work is really cited very, very frequently in church curriculum in the second half of the 20th century. And of course, it's also deeply influential on Bruce R. McConkie, who was the second most important theologian of the church in the 20th century, and who more or less makes a career of repeating and extending what his father-in-law said.
So you write about proof texting. Was that his approach to the scriptures?
In some ways, and I should first define what proof texting is and say a little bit about its history. Proof texting is a pattern of scriptural interpretation, and I should say kind of biblical, because it emerges really among the early Christian fathers who are doing this to the Bible in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD, in which you simply remove a single verse from its context and make an argument from that one verse. Joseph Fielding Smith certainly did this. Many other Christian writers have done it as well. And it is very much, I think, a project that goes all the way back in the history of the LDS Church. Of course, there are certain verses, for instance, Amos 3:7, the famous verse that's often quoted in the church, and the Lord God will do nothing save I reveal my secrets to my servants, the prophets. This is taken entirely out of context. I don't think virtually no member of the church could tell you what Amos 3:6 says or what Amos 3:8 says, right? Another famous proof text is Isaiah 7:14, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, right? And this is often read as a prediction of the birth of Jesus Christ, whereas the context of Isaiah 7, it actually indicates that it's about the Babylonian royal family. Now, Joseph Fielding Smith does do this, right? And I think it is, but he's not the only one. And that's the first point I want to make. This is something that virtually all Christians have done and continue to do. However, I think it says something interesting about Joseph Fielding Smith's approach to Scripture, which is that Fielding Smith approaches Scripture in a very modern way, which is to say he reads Scripture like other modern people might read an encyclopedia or a dictionary. For him, Scripture is a collection of facts divided into chapters and verses. And proof texting then is a perfectly acceptable practice because for him, a verse from the Book of Alma and the Book of Mormon or the Book of Mosiah and the Book of Mormon are functionally the same. That these books might be written by different people or drawing on different sources doesn't matter because Scripture for him is authoritative.
Okay, so why was he so suspicious of the emerging academy of academics?
Yeah, he is certainly suspicious of the emergence of biblical studies, which begins to happen in the 19th century and really flowers in the early 20th century. And he is, I think, part of a broader movement, especially in American Christianity, that is very hostile to biblical studies. And I will say a little bit about what these studies were arguing and then his response to it. So in some ways, there's really two things going on in the academy that draw his ire. The first is what's called the higher criticism of the Bible. Higher criticism is a school of biblical studies that emerges in Germany in the 19th century. And higher critics are interested in trying to determine the social and cultural and historical context of the biblical books, trying to determine where they were written, by who, and what their meaning to the original audiences would have been. And many higher critics then start to explode long-held traditional beliefs about the Bible. They propose, for instance, that certain stories in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, particularly Job and Jonah, may be fiction, and may have been understood by ancient audiences as fiction, that Job and Jonah were not actually real people, for instance. Or, for instance, looking at the New Testament, that the Gospels are assembled out of other texts and sometimes contradict each other, right, and say different things about Jesus. So this is one group of academics that many Christians in the United States find somewhat challenging and threatening, Fielding Smith among them. Another group, though, are geologists and biologists who begin to suggest that the theory of evolution explains the origins of human life, that the Earth is billions and billions of years old. And to some people, this runs contrary to what were long, and I'm not going to say contrary to the book of Genesis, because there are people who argue that it's not contrary to the book of Genesis, but to the ways in which some people have read the book of Genesis, like Joseph Fielding Smith himself. There are a group of Protestants in the early 20th century who really mount campaigns to drive the influence of this scholarship out of American Christianity by imposing, for instance, orthodoxy requirements on ministers and stuff like that. Some of those Protestants call themselves fundamentalists. And while Joseph Fielding Smith certainly has his issues with those Protestants, in many ways he's also sympathetic to them, and in some ways kind of brings some of their ideas into his church.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So let's talk to you. You raised this. The big debate he had about evolution with general authority, a fellow theologian, B.H. Roberts. Okay, and a lot of our listeners may be aware of this and not, but it's a fascinating part of the book. What happened in this debate and how was it resolved? And did anyone, quote, actually win?
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's interesting, I think, that you say that it's about evolution. Because in some ways it's not, actually. And we'll have to kind of nuance that a little bit. So in brief, Roberts is, I think, more sympathetic to another group of American Christians, those who argue that there are ways to reconcile this new scholarship on biblical criticism, this new scholarship on evolution in the age of the earth with Christianity. And Roberts spends much of his later years, and we're in the late 1920s at this point, and by this point, Roberts is in his early 70s, and he has spent years of his life writing this magnum opus, a book called The Truth, the Way, the Life, which is what we call a systematic theology, an attempt to explain everything, to begin with the very beginnings of the universe, to end with the Judgment Day, and to cover everything in between. Right? And Roberts proposes that there may well have been a group of human-like beings on the earth before Adam and Eve. And in fact, the earth may be many, 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 many years old, far longer than Joseph Fielding Smith thought it was. And that these pre-Adamites, as they're sometimes referred to, explain what paleontologists have discovered, which is, fossilized skeletons of creatures that look a lot like human beings from millions and millions of years ago. Roberts points to a couple of pieces of evidence for this. He says that the apostle Orson Hyde, who was a contemporary of Brigham Young, suggested that this was a possibility. He also proposes that the command given to Adam and Eve to replenish the earth indicates that the earth was once, plenished, and that they're replenishing it, right? And so these are some of the evidence Roberts musters for this. Roberts submits this text. He is hoping that The Truth, the Way, the Life will be published by the church in some way, whether through the Sunday school as a curriculum, and Roberts had written a lot of curriculum for the church already, or perhaps by Deseret Book, some kind of outlet in the church might publish it. But that meant it had to be reviewed by the church publication committee. And there's a committee that is convened to review this manuscript, and Fielding Smith is an apostle by this point, and so he is on this committee. And he really, really doesn't like this book. There are a lot of issues he has with it, but the major issue is this question of pre-Adamites. That is, were there people on the earth before Adam and Eve? And he says no. And the reason why he says no is ultimately theological, which is Joseph Fielding Smith believes that there was no death before the fall of Adam. And he reads the book of Genesis and other Latter-day Saint scripture to make that argument. And that's really important to him because he believes that death is caused by the fall of Adam and Eve. And thus the resurrection of Jesus Christ kind of overcomes the fall in that way. And so that if there was death before Adam and Eve, that minimizes the impact of Jesus for Fielding Smith. He also goes very hard at Roberts' arguments. He actually is probably correct that the Hebrew translated replenish in Genesis doesn't mean what Roberts really wants it to mean. He points to a lot of other LDS leaders who say that there was no death before Adam and Eve, that Adam and Eve were the first people. And he says, you have Orson Hyde, but I have all of these other general authorities. And the two have this really big argument. And there are a series of meetings in which both men present their case to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and then ultimately to the First Presidency as well. Roberts arguing that his book should be published. Fielding Smith saying, no, this is heretical. And ultimately, you might say that nobody wins. It is rather famously, the First Presidency says and I should say, maybe not say this part outright. This is from Heber J. Grant's diary, who was president of the church at the time. Grant says, I see no advantage to a continuance of this discussion, which is to say, Heber J. Grant was a fairly practical person. He thought these kinds of theological disputes were obtruse and useless and only served to make people angry at each other. And so he more or less says, I don't want you talking in public about this. And the book is not published for actually about 6 decades. It's finally published in the 1990s. But Grant more or less simply tables the fight.
So they kind of punt the question, right? The First Presidency, we're not going to get into that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They do not come out on either side.
Right.
They do not say who was right or who was wrong. They simply say we don't want to decide.
But you talk about how maybe Joseph Fielding Smith gets sort of a little bit more of a victoy than B.H. Roberts does. Yeah. How is that?
And this in part
I found that fascinating. So
yeah, because I think it does appear, even at the time, that a number of the leaders of the church were more persuaded by Fielding Smith, right? That they thought that he was probably closer to being right than Roberts was. But ultimately, what happens later on is Fielding Smith simply outlives everybody. B.H. Roberts dies in 1933. James Talmage, who was also an apostle and who was quite sympathetic to Fielding Smith, also dies in 1933. John Whitsoe, another scientist apostle, dies in 1951, I believe. And of course, Heber J. Grant, the president of the church, dies in 1945. Fielding Smith outlives them all. And in 1954, he publishes his own book, Man, His Origin, and Destiny, in which that book is drawn. I should say 1954. Excuse me. Let me say that again. In 1951, he publishes his book, Man, His Origin, and Destiny, which is a book that's often largely based on much of the material that he compiled to debunk B.H. Roberts. And this is a book that famously, right, makes the case for a 6,000-year-old Earth, makes the case for Adam and Eve being the first human beings, and spends, and this is often overlooked, the book spends chapters and chapters and chapters attacking both the theory of evolution and higher criticism as a method for studying the Bible. And that book becomes incredibly influential. It is used in CES instruction over the next decade after its publication. It is given to church educators, and it becomes very influential on Smith's son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie's famous book, Mormon Doctrine.
So you already mentioned Talmage and Whitsoe, who were both scientists. What were his issues with those guys, and what was he? Why did he not trust or believe in science?
That is an excellent question. And if you were to ask Fielding Smith what he thought about science, he would tell you that he supports science, that he believes in science. The problem is that science is always a moving target. What is science and what is not science changes every few years. And people who are trained in science will tell you that, right? Which is why it's, I think, a bit silly sometimes to simply say, well, just trust science, right? Because what is science? It's something that is in development constantly. Joseph Fielding Smith and other people like him in the early decades of the 20th century who would argue for a young Earth and against the theory of evolution would tell you that they believed these things were bad science. The sort of science they believed in is a science that really derives from the 18th and 19th centuries, which is premised on personal empirical observation of things. You will still hear creationists tell you, I don't believe in evolution because you can't show it to me. I can't see evolution happening. It's a theory, right? It's not something you can empirically demonstrate. And Fielding Smith says that in his book. He says real science is about hard empirical observation. It's not about theories, about making this sort of stuff up. Right now, of course, Whitsoe and Talmage are professional scientists. They both received PhDs in the sciences in the late 19th century. And they are trained in what is, by the late 19th and early 20th century, a new way of thinking about science, right? A way of thinking about science that will posit what scientists will call theories, right? Which they will say are hypotheses that have a lot of logic and evidence behind them, but not the kind of empirical evidence that Fielding Smith demanded. So part of the argument here is not like science versus religion. That actually is kind of a canard that doesn't really mean a lot. The real argument here is about what is science and what do we take to be actually scientific. And Fielding Smith believed he was being scientific until the end of his life.
So what was his relationship like with the University of Utah philosophy professor Sterling McMurrin? Was there a gentle side to this stern apostle?
Well, not with McMurrin. Well, although maybe in person.
McMurrin once said, although he disagreed about everything, he had affection for Joseph.
Yes, and in person, Fielding Smith was unfailingly polite and generous. He would ask McMurrin about his family when they met, and maintain a real cordial relationship. But behind closed doors and in private correspondence, the two could be fairly scathing about each other. They met a couple of times in the early 1950s because McMurrin was defending to Fielding Smith another book that Fielding Smith scuttled. That was a book on the Hebrew Bible by McMurrin's friend Heber Snell. And McMurrin is a classic kind of mid-20th century liberal, which is to say he's somewhat triumphalist. He believes that he and his generation have figured everything out, and that Joseph Fielding Smith is kind of benighted and behind the times, and is backward looking rather than forward looking. McMurrin has his own blind spots, right? His kind of mid-century triumphalism is, as I point out in the book, is fairly deeply anti-Semitic. For instance, he has no problem using the word like primitive to describe things that he thinks are primitive, right? McMurrin is a liberal in the sense that he believes religion is really just about being a good person and not about anything kind of supernatural, and that rituals are kind of a weird throwback that we shouldn't do anymore, that sort of thing. But McMurrin is also he's seen as kind of a champion and a hero, I think, to a lot of mid to late 20th century Mormon liberals. He is vehemently against, for instance, the racism of the church's priesthood temple ban. He's very vocal about that. And he and Joseph Fielding Smith kind of spar about that and about other things. Meanwhile, McMurrin is telling some of his friends, as I just said, that he thinks that Joseph Fielding Smith is backward, is kind of a figure of the 19th century. And Joseph Fielding Smith is telling people in his correspondence that he wishes that McMurrin would be excommunicated. So while they are, cordial and
not warmth,
to each other, in private, they really, I think, dislike each other. But are both very much, I think, figures of their times, and in many ways, I think we pass both of them by. We can see them as kind of historical constructs.
Okay, so tell us briefly about his clashes with what was then the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, this goes all the way back to the beginning of his career. This is in some ways how he becomes, I think, or finds his calling, we might say. He is in his mid to late 20s. He begins working in this part of his life in the church's historian's office. As an assistant historian for a while. He actually is a colleague of B.H. Roberts there, and that's where they first they don't like each other from the very beginning. But he is asked in the mid-1900s, and by that I mean 1904, 1905, 1906, by his father, who is the president of the church, to respond to some pamphlets that are being circulated around the United States. Now, it's kind of ironic at this point that in 1905, there are pamphlets about Mormons that are getting a lot of traction and a lot of circulation all over the U.S. But this is the period of the Smoot hearings, when Reed Smoot, who is an apostle of the church, is being considered for a seat in the U.S. Senate. And the Senate is very worried about seating a leader of the Mormon church, right, as they're calling it. They're worried about polygamy. They're worried about Mormon theocracy, all of these sorts of things. And the reorganized church, and particularly a man named Richard Evans, who was in the first presidency of the reorganized church, really seizes an opportunity here. And they start circulating pamphlets denouncing the Mormons for practicing polygamy, or I should say denouncing the LDS church, right? Not their church for practicing polygamy, denouncing Brigham Young for being a tyrant, arguing that it is in fact the reorganized church that is the real heirs to Joseph Smith. And that this LDS church, where Reed Smoot is from, they lost the path a long, long time ago. Joseph F. Smith, the president of the church, is not happy about this. He asks his son, Joseph Fielding Smith, to write rebuttals. And Fielding Smith really seizes the task and writes these very, very aggressive and scathing rebuttals to Richard Evans, arguing that, in fact, it's his church that has abandoned everything Joseph Smith stood for. And he really, as I say, I think discovers his voice here as a really vehement defender of what he believes truth to be, as someone, I think, who links his defense of truth to his own sense of his family. And his familial inheritance. And there's something very personal, I think, as I said at the top, about how Joseph Fielding Smith thinks about all of these things that he is doing. And those early pamphlets that I think set him on the path for writing for the next 70 years.
You talk about, Matt, his writing really was intended for a lay audience and lay members in some ways. And one of the most popular things that became is where he did these answers to questions that were in church magazines, and they were compiled in a book later, which was interesting. The church doesn't really do that anymore. I mean, their old magazines used to have people answer questions, but they weren't coming from an apostle. Well, what if they did something like that today? Is what I'm asking. Could that be helpful, or what? I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and as you say, right, this is something that was not unusual in the mid-20th century. John Whitsoe had a column somewhat like this too, where he took questions and answered questions from, just regular members of the church. And Joseph Fielding Smith did this for decades. And he covers all sorts of things, right? The esoteric questions about the lost 10 tribes,
playing cards, everything, right?
All sorts of stuff. You kind of take every sort of question. This is also the period when most church curriculum used in various church classes is signed, right? It's written by a particular person, signed by a particular person, and so you would get this sense for a church that in some ways was a kind of series of voices bouncing off of each other. Different perspectives on what the church was and what the church should teach and what the church should do. Now, in some ways, right, there were real benefits to this, but there was also, I think, a growing fear in the mid to late 1960s. What if one person's idiosyncratic views become taught in every Sunday school class in the church, right? Do we really want Hugh Nibley in charge of what is said in LDS Sunday schools? Maybe we do, right? But next week it might not be Hugh Nibley. It might be someone who believes the lost 10 tribes live in the center of the earth, or something like that, right? So it is in part because of that question that the church begins in the 1970s to move to an ostensibly kind of neutral voice, an institutional voice in which these sorts of columns vanish. Curriculum is not signed anymore. It's all simply coming from this anonymous, faceless source. But of course, right, Joseph Fielding Smith's career was in part devoted to the proposition that that voice ultimately share his own views, that his own views become the institutional orthodoxy. As I say in the book, in some ways he invents the idea of orthodoxy, that there is a conception of what doctrine is that Mormons must believe. And that is what emerges in the curriculum that appears late in his life.
So speaking of defining orthodoxy, Joseph Fielding Smith united with apostles and BYU President Ernest Wilkinson in the 50s to the 70s in transforming BYU into a large research university, but also targeting instructors who didn't share their views of orthodoxy. Did he succeed in doing that?
In some ways, I think this effort is an effort to bring the idea of orthodoxy to a space where there wasn't much of that idea before his time. And this effort is mounted really, as you say, right in the early 50s when Ernest Wilkinson becomes president of BYU. And not simply president of BYU, but also commissioner of church education as a whole. Wilkinson is somewhat sympathetic to Fielding Smith, although less, we should not conflate, I think, two different types of conservatism here. Wilkinson is much more political conservative. Fielding Smith is a Republican, and he's a somewhat conservative Republican, but he doesn't have the same kind of real fixation on politics as someone like Wilkinson or someone like Ezra Taft Benson does. In fact, Fielding Smith is very, very unhappy with Benson's adventures in politics, and he does not want Benson to be doing the sorts of things that he is doing. He doesn't think it's appropriate. But there is built in the mid-50s this kind of alliance across a number of these figures, Wilkinson and Fielding Smith, and a couple I mentioned earlier, particularly Harold B. Lee. And they begin trying to create uniformity in the teaching of religion in the church, all the way from the seminaries all the way up to BYU itself. And they do this in a number of different ways. In the early 1950s, you can find in the David O. McKay diaries, you can find Wilkinson complaining to McKay about the faculty and wanting more control over the faculty. Wilkinson asks David O. McKay if he can see tithing records for faculty. For instance, he hires Cleon Skousen, who is a very, very kind of conspiratorial thinker along the lines of Benson himself. But theologically as well, there are instituted a series of summer sessions. And I want to nod to one of actually my students, Ben Spackman, here has done a lot of work on this in particular. In one summer session in 1954, this is held at BYU. It's 6 weeks of training for religion teachers from BYU all the way down to CES. Harold B. Lee is in charge, and he assigns Man, His Origin, and Destiny as the required reading. Which is, of course, Fielding Smith's book against creationism. And they are telling these teachers, they're expecting their teachers to teach this, right? This is the material. Fielding Smith is the authority on these sorts of questions of doctrine. At one of these sessions, Lowell Bennion, who is a teacher at the University of Utah Institute, challenges Fielding Smith on questions of race and the priesthood temple ban. Later on, Wilkinson forces Bennion out of his position as an educator, in part because of his position on questions of race, but also on his temerity to challenge someone like Joseph Fielding Smith, right? So there is a kind of tightening of what is taught about religion across church education under Wilkinson and under some of these apostles.
You see any similarities to something's happening today?
Oh, certainly, of course, right? I mean, this is sort of what BYU does, right? And BYU has done this frequently. We see BYU moving in cycles on a lot of these things. There are movements towards, I think, retrenchment, as we might call it, as Armin Moss calls it, right? And this sort of sense that there is something called orthodoxy, and orthodoxy is an important part of religion, which is an idea, I think, that Joseph Fielding Smith, more than maybe any particular doctrine, right? The idea that doctrine is important and doctrine should be enforced is his legacy that he left in the church.
So, Matt, I have to ask you a question that you might not be able to answer, but I want to ask it anyway. You've mentioned Bruce R. McConkie, his son-in-law, for a while. And as you said, he became quite influential himself, especially with the publication of Mormon Doctrine. Okay, so in your opinion, who was more conservative and or controversial, Bruce R. McConkie or Joseph Fielding Smith?
Oh, I like that question because it gives me an opportunity. So, of course, the first question here is, what does conservative mean? Mm-hmm. Right. And it's really easy, I think, to kind of flatten it and say, well, all conservatives are exactly the same. That's why I think a lot of people assume that Joseph Fielding Smith and Ezra Taft Benson, of course, would have been allies and everything, even though they really weren't. They disagreed on a lot of things. Do we mean conservative politics? Do we mean conservative theologically? What is theological conservatism? In that sense, I think actually the thing about these two is, well, they're really very close in lockstep on most theological questions, which is to say McConkie grows up reading Fielding Smith. He does not really disagree with Fielding Smith on virtually anything of importance. But I think what is interesting about McConkie is the way he kind of enacts what Fielding Smith is gesturing toward, which is to say, Fielding Smith writes a lot about a lot of different topics, but he's often kind of scattershot in his approach, right? The answers to the gospel questions are from here to there, from playing cards to whether or not dinosaurs are real, all of these kinds of things in between. Man, His Origin and Destiny is a real polemic against evolution and against higher criticism of the Bible. But other than that, much of what Fielding Smith writes is what we might call like sacred history. He writes 2 books that are essentially histories of the world. He writes another that's a history of the church. What McConkie does is take all of these, and then he takes Fielding Smith's idea that orthodoxy is important. And in Mormon Doctrine, McConkie does something deeply modern, which is to say he writes an encyclopedia. He says, right, I have organized all knowledge. Here it is in this book. All right. And so he kind of fulfills, I think, what Fielding Smith is gesturing towards. But he has a much more, and it's, I think, because he's a lawyer, right? Whereas Fielding Smith is a historian. McConkie thinks in this very systematic way. Clause, subclause, 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 right? Which his father-in-law did not think in that way.
And that's sort of what Mormon doctrine comes across as, almost like codifying. This is everything about the church and its teachings, right? I mean, it's like the law, you know. Yeah,
and it's real ambition, right? I mean, I think the first modern thing about Mormon doctrine is the idea that you can do that you can't actually organize every bit of knowledge alphabetically.
Yeah.
Which one was more controversial? You didn't answer that.
Depends on what we mean by, I'm giving you all this like academic evasive answers, right? I will say, I think Fielding Smith emerges in church leadership at a time where people who believe like him are really the distinct minority. He is largely alone in the quorum, not quite alone, right? There are some people like Orson Whitney who are sympathetic to his views. But he really feels, I think, when he becomes an apostle in the first couple of decades, that the Whitsos and the Talmadges and the B.H. Robertses, they're in charge, right? They're the ones who are writing all the curriculum. They're the ones everyone's paying attention to. And so he really does, I think, kind of, lash out in some ways and tries to assert himself and butts heads with people. He even at one point, he has a real dispute with J. Reuben Clark over doctrine. And he and Clark don't get along all that well either. But by the 50s and 60s and 70s, when McConkie becomes a general authority, and then later, McConkie becomes an apostle soon after Fielding Smith dies, more or less all these new younger apostles think like Fielding Smith does. They grew up reading. They grew up thinking him. So McConkie is much less an outlier at that point, right? In fact, he is sort of heralded from the very beginning as a sort of the great fount of wisdom for all of us. Whereas, in 1920 or so, Fielding Smith is not that.
Fascinating. The name of the book, again, is Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon Theologian. Matthew Bowman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.